I never thought watching my dream wedding turn into a nightmare of peach and gold disaster would lead to the most satisfying professional revelation of my career. Even less could I have imagined the look of absolute horror on Madison Clarke's perfectly contoured face when she realized the bride she'd been dismissing and ignoring for months was actually the owner of Clarke Associates Design Company, the very firm that employed her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But that moment of crystal clear recognition, standing in my ruined reception venue surrounded by decorations that looked nothing like what I'd requested, became the catalyst that not only saved my wedding, but transformed me from a pushover client into the CEO who would revolutionize how my company treats every customer. My name is Sarah Chen, and 6 months ago, I thought I had everything figured out. At 28, I was the proud owner of a successful design and event planning company that I'd built from the ground up after graduating from business school. What started as a small interior design consultancy had grown into Clarke Associates Design Company, a full-service firm handling everything from corporate events to luxury weddings across 3 states. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd named the company after my middle name, Clarke, rather than using Chen. It had been a strategic business decision early on, suggested by my mentor who believed a more Western-sounding name would attract a broader client base in our predominantly white upper-middle-class market. Looking back, that choice to obscure my identity should have been my first warning about the industry I was entering. But success had a way of masking uncomfortable truths, and Clarke Associates was undeniably successful. We'd planned events for politicians, celebrities, and Fortune 500 companies. Our portfolio included magazine-worthy weddings that regularly appeared in bridal publications. My team of 12 employees, including 6 event planners and 4 designers, had developed a reputation for flawless execution and creative vision. The problem was, I'd become so focused on building the business that I'd never actually planned my own wedding. When James proposed on a quiet Sunday morning in our kitchen, producing a ring he'd clearly chosen with more love than budget, I realized I'd spent 5 years helping other women create their perfect day, while never imagining my own. James Morrison was everything I hadn't known I needed in a partner. Where I was driven and sometimes frantically organized, he was calm and steady. A high school history teacher with a passion for documentary photography, he grounded me in ways that my ambitious, achievement-focused world rarely provided. We'd met at a charity auction where I was donating event planning services and he was volunteering as a photographer. 6 months of coffee dates, long walks, and conversations that stretched past midnight had convinced me that I'd found someone who saw past my professional success to appreciate the person underneath. Planning our wedding should have been a dream project. After all, I owned one of the most respected event planning companies in the region. I had connections with the best vendors, access to exclusive venues, and a team of talented professionals who could execute any vision I could imagine. What I didn't anticipate was how difficult it would be to step back from the business owner role and become a regular client. That's where Madison Clarke came into the picture. Madison had joined Clarke Associates 18 months earlier, arriving with impressive credentials from a prestigious event planning firm in New York City. Her portfolio showcased elaborate society weddings with budgets that often exceeded 6 figures. She spoke fluent French, had studied at Le Cordon Bleu, and possessed the kind of effortless sophistication that made wealthy clients feel understood and valued. During her interview, Madison had impressed me with her attention to detail, her knowledge of luxury vendors, and her ability to articulate complex design concepts with elegant simplicity. She'd grown up in Connecticut, attended an elite boarding school, and had the social connections that opened doors in exclusive circles. Everything about her screamed success in the high-end wedding market. What I'd failed to recognize during the hiring process was how Madison's polished exterior masked a fundamental lack of respect for clients she deemed beneath her social or economic status. Her charm was calibrated exclusively for those who matched her background and budget expectations. Everyone else received a different version of Madison Clarke, one that was subtly dismissive, professionally condescending, and expertly manipulative. When I approached Madison about planning my own wedding, I thought I was giving her an incredible opportunity, a chance to showcase her skills on a project that would receive significant attention within our industry network. The owner's wedding would be featured in our marketing materials, discussed at industry conferences, and photographed for our professional portfolio. It was the kind of high-visibility project that could establish her reputation and accelerate her career trajectory. My mistake was assuming that Madison would treat me as both her employer and her client, with the respect that either role deserved. Our first meeting should have set off warning bells, but I was too eager to trust my employee and too distracted by the excitement of planning my wedding to recognize the red flags. We met in my office on a Tuesday afternoon in January, 3 months after James's proposal and 6 months before our planned September wedding. "Congratulations on your engagement," Madison said as she settled into the chair across from my desk, her designer handbag placed precisely beside her feet and her leather portfolio open to a fresh page. "I'm absolutely thrilled you've chosen me to handle your special day." I'd prepared extensively for our meeting, creating detailed notes about my vision, preferred color palette, and must-have elements. James and I had spent countless evenings discussing what we wanted our wedding to represent, an elegant but warm celebration that honored both our families' traditions while reflecting our personal style. "I'm so excited to work with you on this," I began, pulling out the folder I'd organized with inspiration photos, venue options, and preliminary guest list information. "James and I have some specific ideas about what we're hoping to create." Madison's smile remained perfectly in place, but I noticed how her eyes barely glanced at the materials I was sharing. Instead, she seemed to be conducting her own assessment of me, taking in my off-the-rack blazer, my practical leather shoes, and my simple engagement ring with an expression that was politely neutral, but somehow made me feel self-conscious. "Of course," she said smoothly. "Tell me about your vision." I described our hope for an outdoor ceremony, if weather permitted, with a reception that felt more like an elegant dinner party than a formal ballroom event. We wanted rich jewel tones, deep blues, emerald greens, and burgundy accents, rather than the pastels that dominated most wedding color schemes. James loved jazz music, so we were hoping to incorporate live musicians rather than a traditional DJ. We wanted food that reflected both our backgrounds, with some Asian influences honoring my heritage alongside more traditional options. As I talked, Madison took notes, nodding appropriately and asking clarifying questions that initially seemed thoughtful and professional. But something felt off about her responses. When I mentioned wanting to incorporate elements that honored my Chinese heritage, she suggested we might want to be careful not to overwhelm guests who might not be familiar with cultural traditions. When I described our preference for a more intimate dinner party atmosphere, she cautioned that understated elegance can sometimes read as insufficient budget to wedding guests. Each suggestion was framed as helpful professional advice, but the cumulative effect was to make me question my own preferences and vision. Madison had a gift for making alternatives sound more sophisticated, more appropriate, more likely to create the impression we presumably wanted to make. "I'm thinking we might want to consider a more classic approach," she said after I'd finished outlining our ideas. "Something timeless that will photograph beautifully and create the right impression for your professional network. After all, this wedding will be seen as a reflection of Clarke Associates' capabilities." That comment should have been my first major warning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Madison was already reframing my wedding not as a personal celebration, but as a business marketing opportunity, which gave her implicit permission to prioritize professional image over personal preference. "What kind of classic approach?" I asked, trying to understand her perspective while feeling slightly defensive about my original vision. Madison opened her portfolio to reveal a series of images that looked like they'd been pulled from the pages of a high-end bridal magazine. Everything was soft, romantic, and undeniably beautiful, but also completely generic. Blush pink and champagne color schemes, cascading floral arrangements dominated by white roses and baby's breath, crystal chandeliers and reception tables that looked like they belonged in a luxury hotel ballroom. These represent the kind of sophisticated elegance that really resonates with discerning clients, she explained, her voice taking on the instructional tone I'd heard her use with particularly challenging customers. Classic, refined, and absolutely appropriate for someone in your position. I stared at the images, trying to reconcile them with the celebration James and I had imagined. Everything Madison was showing me was beautiful, but it felt like someone else's wedding. Where were the jewel tones we'd discussed? The intimate dinner party atmosphere? The cultural elements that would make the day feel personally meaningful? These are lovely, I said carefully, but they're not really what James and I had in mind. We were hoping for something with more personality, more reflection of who we are as a couple. Madison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, we can certainly incorporate personal touches, but I think it's important to consider what will create the most impact for your guests and, frankly, for your business reputation. A classic approach provides a foundation that allows personal elements to shine without overwhelming the overall aesthetic. The way she said personal touches made them sound like afterthoughts, minor accessories to be sprinkled over a predetermined framework rather than integral elements of the design. But I was new to being a wedding client, and Madison was the professional. Maybe she understood something about wedding planning that I, despite my business success, was missing. Let's talk about budget, Madison continued, smoothly transitioning to what I would later recognize as one of her most effective manipulation tactics. What range are we working with? James and I had discussed this extensively. As a business owner, I was financially comfortable, but I also believed in responsible spending. We'd agreed on a budget of $45,000, which was generous without being extravagant. It would allow us to have a beautiful celebration while remaining true to our values about money and priorities. We're thinking around $45,000, I said, watching Madison's expression carefully. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped. I caught a flash of something that looked like disappointment, maybe even disdain, before her practiced smile returned. Absolutely doable, she said, though her tone suggested she was already recalibrating her approach. We'll just need to be strategic about priorities and make sure we're maximizing impact within that framework. The way she said that framework made my budget sound like a limitation to be overcome rather than a reasonable financial parameter. I felt a familiar twist of insecurity, the same feeling I'd experienced when Madison questioned my color preferences and venue ideas. Was my budget insufficient? Were my expectations unrealistic? Is that not enough for what we've discussed? I asked, hating how uncertain I sounded in my own office, talking to my own employee. Oh no, it's definitely workable, Madison assured me quickly. I just want to make sure we're managing expectations appropriately. Some of the elements you've mentioned, live jazz musicians, custom floral arrangements in specific color palettes, venue rentals that can accommodate your timeline, those things can add up quickly. But I'm confident we can create something beautiful within your parameters. Again, that word. Parameters. As if my budget was a constraint that limited her creativity, rather than a framework within which her professional skills could shine. I'd planned dozens of weddings with similar budgets that had been featured in magazines and received rave reviews from guests. Why was Madison making me feel like I was asking for champagne tastes on a beer budget? The meeting continued for another hour, with Madison asking detailed questions about guest count, venue preferences, and timeline. But increasingly, I felt like I was being interviewed rather than consulted. Madison's questions seemed designed to identify problems with my ideas, rather than understand how to implement them. When I mentioned that James's family was Irish Catholic and mine was secular with Buddhist influences, Madison suggested we might want to simplify the ceremony to avoid confusing guests. When I described our hope for a late afternoon ceremony, with cocktail hour and dinner, she cautioned that outdoor events required significant backup planning and additional budget allocation. When I showed her inspiration photos of jewel-toned floral arrangements, she noted that bold colors can be challenging to photograph and might not age well in wedding albums. Each concern was presented as professional expertise, but the cumulative effect was to make our original vision seem impractical, risky, or aesthetically questionable. By the end of the meeting, I found myself agreeing to consider Madison's classic elegance approach as a foundation that could incorporate carefully selected personal elements. "I think this is going to be absolutely wonderful," Madison said, as we concluded, gathering her materials with efficient precision. "I'll prepare some preliminary concepts based on our discussion, and we can review them next week. I'm confident we can create something that exceeds your expectations." After she left, I sat in my office feeling oddly deflated. I'd entered the meeting excited about planning my wedding and confident about my vision. I was leaving it uncertain about my choices and vaguely ashamed of my budget limitations. Madison had managed to make me feel like a difficult client rather than a valued customer, despite the fact that I was both her employer and the person paying for her services. That evening, I tried to share my concerns with James, but found it difficult to articulate exactly what had bothered me about the meeting. Madison hadn't said anything overtly problematic. She'd been professional, knowledgeable, and seemingly invested in creating a beautiful wedding. My discomfort felt petty and oversensitive. "Maybe she's right about keeping things classic," James said as we cleaned up after dinner. "I don't really know much about wedding planning, but she's the professional, and it is your business reputation we're talking about." His response, though well-intentioned, reinforced Madison's implied message that my original preferences were somehow naive or inappropriate. If my own fiancé was agreeing with the professional, maybe I really was overthinking things. The next week, Madison presented her preliminary concepts, and I felt my heart sink as she revealed inspiration boards that looked exactly like the generic elegance she'd shown me during our first meeting. Soft pink and champagne colors dominated every image. The floral arrangements were exclusively white roses and eucalyptus. The table settings were crystal and gold, elegant but utterly predictable. "I've created a foundation that we can personalize, with carefully chosen accents," Madison explained, her tone suggesting she was doing me a favor by providing such professional guidance. "This approach will photograph beautifully and create the sophisticated impression that's so important for your professional network." I stared at the boards, trying to find any trace of the celebration James and I had imagined. What about the jewel tones we discussed? The jazz musicians? The cultural elements? Madison's expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught a hint of impatience in her voice. "I think we need to be realistic about what works within your budget and venue constraints. Bold colors are more expensive to execute properly, and live musicians can be challenging to coordinate. We can certainly add some personal touches, but I really think this foundation provides the best framework for success." There was that word again, framework, as if my personal preferences were obstacles to be managed rather than the entire purpose of the event. But I was caught in a trap I didn't fully recognize at the time. Madison was my employee, but she was also the expert I'd hired to plan my wedding. Challenging her professional judgment felt like micromanaging, but accepting her recommendations meant abandoning everything that had made James and me excited about our celebration. Over the following weeks, Madison continued to present options that bore no resemblance to what we'd originally discussed. Every suggestion I made was met with professional concern about budget limitations, logistical challenges, or aesthetic appropriateness. When I insisted we needed to incorporate at least some jewel tones, Madison reluctantly agreed to include burgundy napkins as a pop of color. When I mentioned the importance of having some Asian-influenced food options, she suggested spring rolls as an appetizer option that would be familiar enough not to alienate guests. Each compromise felt small in isolation, but collectively they were transforming our wedding into something completely different from what we'd envisioned. I was paying Madison to plan my dream wedding, but somehow I was ending up with her vision instead of mine. The breaking point came during our venue walkthrough in early March. Madison had selected 3 potential locations, all of which specialized in traditional wedding receptions rather than the more intimate dinner party atmosphere James and I preferred. The first venue was a country club ballroom with crystal chandeliers and formal table settings. The second was a hotel conference space that could be transformed with the right lighting and drapery. The third was a historic mansion that offered elegant but completely conventional event spaces. "These are all beautiful," I said as we finished touring the country club, "but they don't really fit what we discussed. Remember, we wanted something that felt more intimate, maybe with an outdoor ceremony option." Madison's professional smile was starting to look strained. "I understand your preference for something more casual, but we need to consider your guest count and weather contingencies. Outdoor ceremonies are lovely in theory, but they require significant backup planning and additional rental costs that might not be realistic within your budget." I felt the familiar spiral of self-doubt beginning again. Was I being unrealistic? Was my vision too complicated or expensive to execute properly? But then I remembered that I'd planned dozens of outdoor weddings within similar budgets. I knew it was possible because I'd done it successfully for other clients. "Madison," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional, "I've planned outdoor weddings before. I know the logistics can be managed within our budget. What I'm not understanding is why none of these venues offer the kind of intimate, personalized setting we initially discussed." For the first time since we'd started working together, Madison's mask slipped completely. Her expression shifted from professional concern to barely concealed frustration. "Sarah, I think you need to decide whether you want to trust my professional expertise or try to micromanage every detail based on your preferences. I'm trying to create something sophisticated and appropriate for your position, but that requires some flexibility on your part." The condescending tone was unmistakable now. Madison was speaking to me like I was a difficult client who didn't understand the complexities of event planning, despite the fact that I owned a successful event planning company and had been executing complex celebrations for years. But what shocked me most was how reflexively I found myself apologizing. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to question your expertise. I just want to make sure we're creating something that feels like us." "Of course," Madison said, her professional demeanor snapping back into place. "I'm confident we can create something beautiful that meets your needs. Let me look into some additional venue options that might offer more flexibility." The drive back to the office was quiet, with Madison making notes on her tablet while I processed what had just happened. I'd been made to feel like an unreasonable client for wanting my own preferences honored at my own wedding. More troubling, I'd immediately capitulated and apologized for expressing those preferences, as if wanting agency over my own celebration was somehow inappropriate. That evening, I found myself researching venues on my own, something that should have been Madison's responsibility. Within an hour, I'd identified 3 locations that perfectly matched our original vision: a botanical garden with indoor and outdoor options, a restored barn with rustic elegance and stunning natural settings, and a historic estate with intimate event spaces and comprehensive vendor relationships. All 3 venues were within our budget. All 3 could accommodate our guest count and timeline. All 3 offered exactly the kind of atmospheric and aesthetic flexibility that would allow us to create the celebration we'd originally imagined. Why hadn't Madison included any of these options in her recommendations? Why was she steering us exclusively toward traditional hotel-style venues that bore no resemblance to our stated preferences? The answer would become clear over the following weeks as I paid closer attention to Madison's client interactions and business practices. But at the time, I was still trapped in the dynamic she'd skillfully established, questioning my own judgment and deferring to her supposed expertise while feeling increasingly disconnected from what was supposed to be one of the most joyful experiences of my life. The pattern continued through March and into April. Every meeting with Madison left me feeling smaller, more uncertain, and more convinced that my original vision for our wedding was somehow naive or inappropriate. She had a remarkable talent for making me feel grateful for her professional guidance while systematically dismantling everything that would have made our celebration personally meaningful. It wasn't until I overheard Madison talking to another client in late April that I began to understand what was really happening. I was working late in my office when I heard Madison's voice in the conference room next door, discussing wedding plans with what sounded like a particularly demanding client. "Absolutely," Madison was saying, her voice warm and enthusiastic in a way I rarely heard during our meetings. "The jewel tone palette will be absolutely stunning, especially with the outdoor ceremony setting. I have several venue options that would be perfect for creating that intimate dinner party atmosphere you're hoping for." Every word was exactly what I'd been asking for during our meetings for months. The jewel tones Madison had dismissed as impractical for my wedding. The intimate dinner party setting she'd declared inappropriate for my professional position. The outdoor ceremony she'd insisted was too risky within my budget constraints. I stood frozen in my office doorway, listening to Madison enthusiastically plan the exact wedding I'd originally described to her, but for someone else. Someone whose budget, I would later learn, was nearly twice what James and I had allocated for our celebration. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Madison wasn't incapable of executing my vision. She simply didn't think I was worth the effort. My budget, my background, or my perceived social status had led her to categorize me as a client who deserved generic elegance, rather than personalized attention. I was paying Madison to plan my wedding, but she was treating me like a second-tier customer whose preferences could be ignored and whose vision could be replaced with whatever was easier for her to execute. Worse, she'd been so skillful in her manipulation that she'd convinced me to doubt my own judgment and feel grateful for her condescending guidance. Standing in my office, listening to Madison plan my dream wedding for someone else, I felt something shift inside me. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had plagued me for months began transforming into something much more powerful: clarity. For the first time since this process began, I saw the situation with complete objectivity. I wasn't a difficult client with unrealistic expectations. I was a successful business owner being manipulated and disrespected by my own employee. Madison had systematically undermined my confidence, dismissed my preferences, and convinced me to accept a lesser version of my own celebration because she didn't believe I deserved better. But what Madison didn't know was that her employment at Clarke Associates Design Company was entirely dependent on my satisfaction with her performance. And what she definitely didn't know was that I'd been documenting every interaction, every dismissive comment, and every instance of her steering clients toward solutions that benefited her convenience rather than their vision. As I stood there listening to her enthusiastically plan the wedding I'd been told was impossible within my budget, I realized that Madison Clarke was about to discover exactly who she'd been dismissing and manipulating for the past 4 months. The game was about to change completely, and she had no idea what was coming. The Monday morning after I overheard Madison planning my dream wedding for someone else, I walked into my office with a completely different perspective. The uncertainty and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment for months had crystallized into laser-focused determination. I wasn't going to confront Madison immediately. That would be reactive and emotional. Instead, I was going to conduct a thorough investigation into exactly how she'd been operating within my company. I started by reviewing Madison's client files, something I should have been doing regularly as a responsible business owner, but had neglected due to my trust in her professional capabilities. What I discovered made my stomach turn with a combination of anger and professional embarrassment. Madison had been categorizing clients into different tiers based on their budgets and perceived social status, then providing dramatically different levels of service accordingly. Clients with budgets exceeding $75,000 received what she called premium consultation, which included multiple venue options, custom design concepts, and unlimited revision meetings. Clients with budgets between $50,000 and $75,000 received standard service, which meant pre-selected vendor recommendations and modified versions of previous successful events. Clients with budgets below $50,000 were relegated to what her internal notes described as efficient solutions, essentially package deals with minimal customization. My own wedding, with its $45,000 budget, had been filed under efficient solutions from our very first meeting. Madison had never intended to honor my preferences or create something personalized. She'd planned to sell me a template and convince me it was exactly what I needed. But the financial categorization was only part of the story. Madison's client notes revealed a pattern of cultural and social prejudice that was both professionally unethical and personally devastating to read. Clients with ethnic surnames or requests for cultural elements were flagged as high maintenance, with notes about managing expectations regarding traditional appropriateness. Clients from working-class backgrounds were described as needing guidance toward realistic aesthetic choices. Clients who questioned her recommendations were labeled as difficult, with strategies outlined for redirecting their focus toward achievable goals. Reading through months of Madison's internal documentation, I saw my own experience reflected in dozens of other cases. The systematic dismissal of client preferences, the subtle undermining of confidence, the manipulation disguised as professional expertise. Madison had turned client service into a sophisticated con game, extracting payment while delivering substandard results to anyone she deemed unworthy of her full attention. What made it worse was realizing how effective her methods had been. Client satisfaction surveys showed that most people rated their experience positively, despite receiving significantly less than what they'd originally requested. Madison had a gift for making people feel grateful for compromises they never should have been asked to make. I spent the entire morning reviewing case files, taking detailed notes, and building a comprehensive understanding of Madison's operating methods. By lunchtime, I had documented evidence of discrimination, misrepresentation, and breach of client contracts across multiple events. More importantly, I had a clear understanding of the systemic problems Madison's approach was creating for my company's reputation and client relationships. The revelation that hurt most personally was discovering that Madison had been actively discouraging certain types of clients from booking with Clarke Associates. Her intake conversations with potential customers included subtle signals about whether their vision was realistic or appropriate for our brand standards. Clients who didn't fit her narrow definition of suitable customers were steered toward competitors or convinced to postpone their events until they could invest appropriately in the experience they deserved. I was losing business because my own employee was deciding who was worthy of our services based on her personal biases and social prejudices. The company I'd built on principles of inclusive excellence and personalized service was being transformed into an exclusive boutique that catered only to Madison's preferred demographic. The most damning evidence came from Madison's email correspondence with vendors. She'd been negotiating different pricing structures based on her assessment of client budgets and sophistication levels. Vendors were charging higher rates for clients Madison designated as premium, while offering discounted packages for clients she labeled as price-sensitive. The markup structures meant that clients were paying dramatically different amounts for identical services, with the difference going directly into Madison's commission arrangements. My hands were shaking as I printed out email chains that revealed the full scope of Madison's deception. She'd established herself as a power broker within the vendor network, determining not just which services clients received, but how much they paid for them. She was essentially running a secondary business within my company, using my reputation and resources to generate personal profit while providing substandard service to customers she deemed unworthy of her attention. The phone rang just as I was finishing my documentation review. The caller ID showed the name Jennifer Walsh, one of Madison's recent clients whose wedding had taken place 3 weeks earlier. "Ms. Chen?" Jennifer began, her voice tight with controlled frustration. "I'm calling because I'm not sure how else to handle this situation. I need to discuss some serious concerns about Madison Clarke's handling of my wedding." I felt my chest tighten. Jennifer's wedding had been one of Madison's efficient solutions cases, with a budget of $42,000 and what Madison's notes had described as working-class aesthetic preferences requiring significant guidance. "Of course, Jennifer. What's going on?" "The wedding was beautiful," she said carefully, "but it wasn't what we planned or paid for. Madison convinced us that our original ideas weren't practical within our budget, so we agreed to what she called a refined approach. We trusted her expertise and assumed she knew best. The familiar pattern was already emerging, but I let Jennifer continue. The problem is, I just saw photos from another wedding Madison planned the same weekend, and it had every single element she told us was impossible within our budget. The outdoor ceremony we asked for, the rustic floral arrangements we wanted, even the same vendor we specifically requested, but were told was unavailable." Jennifer's voice was getting stronger as she talked, the politeness giving way to legitimate anger. "Ms. Chen, I've been planning events professionally for a nonprofit for 8 years. I know what things cost and what's realistic to execute. Madison lied to us about what was possible, convinced us to accept something completely different, then delivered our original vision to another client the same weekend. My worst fears were being confirmed in real time. Madison hadn't just been providing different levels of service based on her personal biases. She'd been actively deceiving clients about what was possible within their budgets while delivering their exact requests to higher-paying customers. Jennifer, I'm so sorry this happened. Can you give me specific details about what was promised versus what was delivered?" For the next 30 minutes, Jennifer walked me through a point-by-point comparison between her wedding and the other event Madison had planned. Every single element Jennifer had originally requested and been told was impossible had been executed flawlessly for the other client, whose budget had been nearly identical to Jennifer's, but whose social connections had apparently earned her Madison's premium treatment. "The worst part," Jennifer concluded, "is that Madison made us feel like we were being unreasonable for wanting what we wanted. She was so professional about explaining why our ideas wouldn't work that we ended up feeling grateful she was willing to work with us at all." After Jennifer's call, I sat in my office staring out at the city skyline, trying to process the full implications of what I'd discovered. Madison hadn't just been providing poor service. She'd been operating a sophisticated scam that exploited clients' trust while damaging my company's reputation and values. But more personally, I realized that everything I'd experienced during my own wedding planning process had been a deliberate manipulation designed to extract payment while providing minimal service. Madison had identified me as an efficient solutions client and proceeded accordingly, never intending to honor my preferences or create something meaningful. The feelings of inadequacy, uncertainty, and self-doubt that had plagued me for months hadn't been the result of unrealistic expectations or poor communication. They'd been the predictable outcome of being systematically manipulated by someone who'd decided I didn't deserve honest service or respectful treatment. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Lisa Rodriguez, an event planning colleague who'd started her business around the same time I'd launched Clarke Associates. Lisa and I had maintained a friendly professional relationship, often referring clients to each other when our schedules were full or when projects fell outside our specialties. "Sarah," Lisa answered on the second ring. "How are the wedding? Plans coming along? I've been dying to hear about what you're creating for yourself." Actually, Lisa, that's why I'm calling. I need some perspective on something, and I trust your professional judgment completely. Of course. What's going on? I spent the next 20 minutes walking Lisa through my experience with Madison, from the initial dismissal of my preferences to the systematic steering toward generic solutions. I described Madison's concerns about my budget limitations, her warnings about cultural elements being overwhelming, and her insistence that my original vision wasn't appropriate for my professional position. Lisa was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Sarah, can I ask what your actual budget is? $45,000. Are you kidding me? Lisa's voice was sharp with disbelief. I've planned dozens of weddings with budgets half that size that included everything you just described. Outdoor ceremonies, live jazz musicians, custom floral arrangements in jewel, tones, cultural elements, intimate dinner party settings. None of that is remotely challenging within your budget range. Hearing Lisa confirm what I'd known intellectually but had been convinced to doubt was like having weights lifted off my shoulders. So I wasn't being unrealistic? Sarah, you could have the wedding of your dreams twice over with $45,000. Either Madison is completely incompetent, which I doubt given her background, or she's deliberately misleading you for reasons I can't understand. I think I'm starting to understand the reasons, I said grimly. And they have nothing to do with budget limitations or logistical challenges. After my conversation with Lisa, I decided to conduct an experiment. I created a fictional client profile using a friend's name and contact information, complete with a fabricated background that would appeal to Madison's apparent preferences. This fictional client was described as a pharmaceutical heiress planning a wedding with a $70,000 budget and specific requests for outdoor ceremonies, jewel-toned florals, and jazz musicians. Within 2 hours of my friend's initial inquiry call, Madison had responded with an enthusiastic email outlining exactly how all of those elements could be beautifully executed within the specified budget. She included venue recommendations that perfectly matched what I'd been requesting for months, vendor suggestions for the specific aesthetic choices I'd been told were impractical, and timeline proposals that accommodated every preference I'd been convinced to abandon. The email concluded with Madison's signature warmth. I'm absolutely thrilled to work with someone who has such sophisticated taste and clear vision. This is going to be the wedding of your dreams, and I can't wait to bring every detail to life, exactly as you've imagined. Reading those words felt like being slapped. Madison was capable of enthusiasm, creativity, and client advocacy. She simply chose not to extend those professional courtesies to clients she'd decided weren't worth her full effort. I forwarded Madison's response to my own email and sat staring at the contrast between her approach to my fictional heiress client and her treatment of me. The same requests that had been deemed impractical and inappropriate for my wedding were being celebrated as sophisticated and exciting when they came from someone with a larger budget and presumably higher social status. That afternoon, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I was going to fire Madison Clarke as my wedding planner. More than that, I was going to fire Madison Clarke as my employee. Her discrimination against clients, her deceptive business practices, and her breach of professional ethics were grounds for immediate termination. But I wasn't going to act impulsively or emotionally. Madison had built her manipulation around my uncertainty and self-doubt. My response was going to be methodical, well-documented, and strategically designed to protect both my company's reputation and my clients' interests. First, I needed to understand the full scope of Madison's client, mismanagement. I spent the rest of the week conducting what I called satisfaction audits with Madison's recent clients, framing the conversations as routine quality control rather than investigation into specific problems. The results were both enlightening and deeply troubling. Nearly 70% of Madison's clients had experienced some form of preference dismissal or budget manipulation. Many had been convinced to accept alternatives to their original visions based on warnings about practicality, appropriateness, or cost considerations that turned out to be completely fabricated. Several had discovered after their events that identical elements had been successfully executed for other clients within similar budget ranges. Most disturbing was the pattern of cultural discrimination I uncovered. Clients requesting elements that honored their ethnic heritage had been systematically discouraged from including those features, with Madison citing concerns about guest comfort, photographic challenges, or aesthetic coherence. One bride had been talked out of a traditional Indian ceremony in favor of a more universally appealing Western format, despite having specifically chosen our company based on our advertised commitment to celebrating diverse traditions. Another client, planning a wedding that would honor both her Mexican heritage and her fiancé's Italian background, had been convinced that combining cultural elements would create confusion and aesthetic discord. Madison had steered her toward what she called a sophisticated neutral approach that eliminated all cultural specificity in favor of generic elegance. Reading through these cases, I realized that Madison's discrimination wasn't just personally offensive. It was threatening the core values and business model that had made Clarke Associates successful. We'd built our reputation on inclusive excellence and personalized service, but Madison was transforming us into an exclusive boutique that catered only to clients who matched her narrow social and aesthetic preferences. The financial implications were equally serious. Madison's tiered service model and vendor manipulation had created significant liability issues for my company. Clients who'd paid identical amounts were receiving dramatically different levels of service, which constituted breach of contract and potentially fraudulent business practices. If any of her discriminated clients decided to pursue legal action, Clarke Associates could face serious financial and reputational consequences. By Friday afternoon, I had compiled a comprehensive case file documenting Madison's unethical practices, discriminatory treatment of clients, and breach of employment responsibilities. I had testimony from affected clients, email evidence of her deceptive communications, and financial records showing the disparities in service delivery. More importantly, I had a plan for moving forward that would protect my clients' interests while rebuilding the integrity of my company's operations. Madison's termination would be immediate and well documented, but her client responsibilities would be seamlessly transferred to ensure that upcoming events were executed with the professionalism and respect every customer deserved. Saturday morning. I called James to discuss what I'd discovered and my decision to terminate Madison's employment. I'd been documenting everything throughout the week, but hadn't wanted to burden him with the details until I had a clear action plan. "So she's been discriminating against clients based on their budgets and backgrounds?" James asked after I'd summarized the situation. "Systematically, including us. Everything she told us about budget limitations and aesthetic appropriateness was completely fabricated. She just didn't think we were worth her full professional effort." James was quiet for a long moment. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. I should have supported your instincts instead of encouraging you to trust her professional judgment. You knew something was wrong from the beginning. You couldn't have known what was really happening. Madison is extremely skilled at manipulation. She convinced dozens of clients to accept substandard service while feeling grateful for her expertise. What are you going to do about our wedding?" I smiled, feeling genuinely excited about our celebration for the first time in months. "We're going to plan exactly the wedding we originally wanted. Outdoor ceremony, jewel tones, jazz musicians, cultural elements that honor both our backgrounds, intimate dinner party reception, everything Madison convinced us was impossible." And Madison? Madison is about to discover that the bride she's been dismissing and manipulating is actually the person who signs her paychecks. Sunday evening, I received an unexpected email from Madison with the subject line, "Final Wedding. Concepts for Review." I opened it to find the same generic blush and champagne inspiration boards she'd been presenting for months, with a note explaining that she'd refined the design to ensure maximum sophistication and guest appeal. Attached to the email was a detailed timeline for our remaining planning meetings, all scheduled around Madison's availability and preferences rather than mine. The tone was politely professional, but carried the underlying assumption that I would accept whatever she'd prepared without significant discussion or modification. The email concluded with a paragraph that crystallized everything problematic about Madison's approach. I'm confident this elegant foundation will create exactly the impression you want to make for your professional network while remaining within the practical limitations we've discussed. Sometimes the most sophisticated approach is the one that appears effortless, and I believe we've achieved that balance perfectly. Reading those words, I felt the last remnants of uncertainty disappear completely. Madison had spent months conditioning me to believe that my preferences were naive, my budget was limiting, and my vision was inappropriate. She'd convinced me to feel grateful for accepting a lesser version of my own celebration while positioning herself as the expert whose judgment superseded my own desires. Tomorrow morning, Madison Clarke was going to discover exactly who she'd been manipulating and dismissing for the past 4 months. She was going to learn that the bride she'd categorized as an efficient solutions client was actually the owner of Clarke Associates Design Company. And she was going to find out that her employment depended entirely on the satisfaction of the very client she'd been systematically deceiving and disrespecting. I spent Sunday night preparing for what would undoubtedly be one of the most important confrontations of my professional career. Madison had built her manipulation around information asymmetry. She'd positioned herself as the expert while making me feel like an uninformed client who needed her guidance. Tomorrow, that dynamic was going to change completely. Madison was going to face the consequences of her actions while I reclaimed not just my wedding plans, but my confidence in my own judgment and my authority as a business owner. The game was about to shift entirely, and Madison had no idea what was coming. As I lay in bed that night, touching the simple engagement ring James had chosen with such care, I realized that this confrontation was about much more than wedding planning or employee management. It was about reclaiming my voice, my authority, and my right to be treated with the respect I deserved both as a customer and as the person responsible for Madison's employment. Madison had systematically undermined my confidence while positioning herself as indispensable. She'd convinced me to doubt my own judgment while extracting payment for services she had no intention of providing honestly. But tomorrow morning, the power dynamic was going to shift completely. Madison was about to discover that the client she'd been dismissing had the authority to end her career at my company with a single conversation. And I was finally ready to use that authority. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and crystal clear skies, which felt like a favorable omen for what I knew would be a pivotal day in both my personal and professional life. I arrived at the office an hour earlier than usual, wanting to ensure everything was perfectly organized before Madison's scheduled arrival at 9 o'clock. My assistant, Rebecca, was already at her desk when I walked in, her usual efficiency enhanced by what seemed like nervous energy. "Good morning, Ms. Chen. Your calendar is clear until 10:30 as requested, and I've prepared the conference room according to your specifications." Rebecca had been with Clarke Associates since our second year of operation, and her loyalty and discretion had made her invaluable to the company's success. She didn't know the specific details of why I'd requested a private meeting with Madison, but her professional instincts had clearly picked up on the gravity of the situation. "Thank you, Rebecca. When Madison arrives, please ask her to join me in my office immediately. And please hold all calls during our meeting unless there's an absolute emergency." At exactly 9 o'clock, I heard Madison's voice in the reception area, her tone carrying its usual professional cheerfulness as she exchanged pleasantries with Rebecca. Through my office window, I watched her walk toward my door with the confident stride of someone who had no idea her world was about to change completely. Madison knocked twice before entering, her designer handbag perfectly coordinated with her cream-colored blazer, and her smile radiating the practiced warmth that had initially impressed me during her hiring interview. "Good morning, Sarah." I Hope you had a chance to review the wedding concepts I sent yesterday. I'm excited to discuss the final details and move forward with vendor confirmations. Please sit down, Madison, I said, gesturing toward the chair across from my desk while maintaining a neutral but serious expression. We need to have a comprehensive discussion about your performance and client management practices. Something in my tone must have registered as unusual because Madison's confident demeanor flickered slightly as she settled into the chair. Of course. Is there a specific aspect of the planning process you'd like to discuss? I opened the thick folder I'd prepared, containing printed copies of all the documentation I'd gathered over the past week. Madison, I've been conducting a thorough review of client satisfaction and service delivery across all our recent projects. What I've discovered is deeply concerning and requires immediate attention. Madison's expression shifted from confident professionalism to cautious attention, but she maintained her composure. I'm always open to feedback about improving our client experience. What specific areas would you like me to address? Let's start with your approach to client categorization and service differentiation, I said, sliding a printed copy of her internal client notes across the desk. Can you explain your system for classifying clients into premium, standard, and efficient solution categories? The color drained from Madison's face as she recognized her own handwriting, but she quickly attempted to regain control of the situation. Those are just organizational notes to help me tailor our services to different client needs and budget. Parameters. It's standard practice in the industry to customize our approach based on project scope. Interesting, I replied, pulling out another document. Because here's an email chain where you're providing identical services to two clients with nearly identical budgets, but charging significantly different amounts based on what you've labeled their sophistication levels. Can you walk me through how that represents appropriate client service? Madison's professional mask was beginning to crack, but she attempted to maintain her explanatory tone. Sarah, event planning is complex, and sometimes pricing varies based on specific vendor requirements, timing constraints, and logistical challenges that aren't immediately apparent in the basic budget numbers. Madison, I said firmly, I've been running this company for 5 years. I understand event planning logistics better than most people in this industry. What I'm seeing in your documentation isn't sophisticated pricing management. It's systematic discrimination based on your personal assessment of who deserves quality service. For the first time since I'd known her, Madison looked genuinely uncertain. She glanced at the documents spread across my desk, clearly trying to assess how much I actually knew and what her best defensive strategy might be. I think there might be some misunderstanding about my client management approach, she said carefully. I've always prioritized delivering excellent service within the parameters each client establishes. If there have been communication issues or unmet expectations, I'm absolutely willing to address those immediately. I leaned back in my chair, studying Madison's face as she attempted to navigate what she clearly recognized as dangerous territory. Communication issues. That's an interesting way to describe it. Let me share some specific examples of what I've uncovered. Over the next 20 minutes, I walked Madison through case after case of her discriminatory practices. The Asian American bride who'd been discouraged from incorporating cultural elements because they might overwhelm guests. The working-class couple who'd been steered away from their preferred vendors toward more appropriate options that happened to pay Madison higher commissions. The clients with modest budgets who'd been convinced their original visions were unrealistic, while identical requests were enthusiastically executed for higher-paying customers. With each example, Madison's attempts at explanation became more desperate and less credible. She tried blaming vendor limitations, budget constraints, and logistical challenges, but I had documentation proving that identical services had been provided to other clients under virtually identical circumstances. Madison, I said when she paused in her increasingly frantic justifications, I have testimony from multiple clients who were told their requests were impossible within their budgets, only to discover later that you'd executed those exact same elements for other clients the same weekend. How do you explain that? Madison's composure finally cracked completely. Sarah, I think you're misinterpreting standard business practices as something more problematic than they actually are. Every event planner adjusts their approach based on client capabilities and realistic expectations. I've been trying to protect Clarke Associates' reputation by ensuring we deliver appropriate services that reflect well on our brand. Protect our reputation? I repeated, feeling my anger rise despite my attempts to maintain professional detachment. Madison, you've been systematically discriminating against clients based on their ethnic backgrounds, social status, and budget levels. You've been lying to customers about what's possible within their price ranges while providing superior service to clients you personally deem more worthy. How exactly is that protecting anything? Madison's face flushed with what looked like a combination of embarrassment and defiance. I've been trying to maintain standards and ensure that our clients receive services that match their actual needs rather than unrealistic fantasies. Sometimes that requires honest conversations about what's appropriate and achievable. Whose needs, Madison? Theirs or yours? I pulled out the email correspondence with the fictional pharmaceutical heiress client. Because here's your response. To a client requesting outdoor ceremonies, jewel-toned florals, and jazz musicians with a $70,000 budget. You called her vision sophisticated and exciting and promised to bring every detail to life exactly as she imagined. Madison stared at the printed email, recognition dawning in her eyes. I don't understand what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you directly that you've been providing different levels of service based on your personal biases about who deserves quality treatment. And Madison, that includes your approach to planning my own wedding. The moment I said those words, something shifted in Madison's expression. The defensive professionalism gave way to what looked like calculating assessment, as if she was finally seeing me as something other than a difficult client to be managed. Your wedding is receiving the same professional attention I provide to all my clients, she said, but her tone had changed from explanatory to carefully neutral. Really? I pulled out the final piece of documentation I'd prepared. Because here are your internal notes about my wedding planning process. You've classified me as an efficient solutions client who needs guidance toward realistic aesthetic choices and whose cultural preferences require careful management to avoid overwhelming guests. You've documented strategies for redirecting my focus toward achievable goals rather than honoring the vision I actually requested. Madison's eyes widened as she read her own words, clearly realizing for the first time that I had access to documentation she'd assumed would remain private. Sarah, those are just planning notes to help me deliver the best possible service. Madison, I interrupted, my voice carrying the authority I should have asserted months ago. You've spent 4 months manipulating me into accepting a generic version of my own wedding while convincing me that my original preferences were naive and inappropriate. You've made me doubt my own judgment while positioning yourself as the expert whose recommendations supersede my personal desires. I've been providing professional guidance based on my experience and expertise, Madison replied, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Have you? I leaned forward, making direct eye contact. Because I've spoken with multiple industry colleagues who confirmed that everything I originally requested was completely achievable within my budget. The outdoor ceremony you declared impractical. The jewel-toned florals you said were photographically challenging. The jazz musicians you claimed were too expensive to coordinate properly. All of it was not only possible but relatively straightforward to execute. Madison's face had gone pale, and for the first time in our entire working relationship, she seemed at a loss for words. The smooth, professional explanations that had characterized her responses to every previous challenge weren't materializing. I think, she said finally, there may have been some miscommunication about project parameters and service expectations. If you're unsatisfied with any aspect of the planning process, I'm absolutely committed to making whatever adjustments are necessary to ensure your complete satisfaction. It was fascinating to watch Madison attempt to recalibrate her approach in real time, shifting from defensive justification to damage control as she began to grasp the seriousness of her situation. But she still didn't understand the full scope of what she was facing. "Madison," I said quietly, "do you know who owns Clarke Associates Design Company?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "Of course, you do. Sarah Chen is the founder and owner." "And do you understand what that means regarding your employment here?" Madison blinked several times, and I could see the pieces finally beginning to connect in her mind. "You're my employer." "I'm your employer, Madison. The bride whose preferences you've been dismissing for months, whose vision you've systematically undermined, whose confidence you've manipulated. I'm the person who hired you, who pays your salary, and who has the authority to terminate your employment." The transformation in Madison's expression was immediate and dramatic. The condescending professionalism that had characterized every interaction we'd had about my wedding planning evaporated completely, replaced by something that looked like genuine panic. "Sarah, I had no idea. I mean, I knew you owned the company, but I didn't realize you were personally involved in the wedding planning process in that capacity. I thought you were just another client, and I was trying to provide the same professional service I offer everyone." "The same professional service?" I repeated. "Madison, I have documentation proving that you provide dramatically different levels of service based on your assessment of client worth. The professional service you offered me was substandard, discriminatory, and professionally unethical." Madison's hands were visibly shaking as she processed the full implications of her situation. "If there have been misunderstandings or service failures, I take complete responsibility and I'm committed to making immediate corrections. Your wedding will be everything you've envisioned, I promise." "Madison, this isn't about my wedding anymore. This is about a pattern of discriminatory business practices that violate both company policy and basic professional ethics. You've been defrauding clients, manipulating vendor relationships for personal gain, and providing substandard service to customers based on your personal biases about their worth. I can fix this," Madison said desperately. "Whatever problems you've identified, I can address them immediately. I'll revise all current client projects to ensure they meet the highest standards. I'll adjust my approach to eliminate any inconsistencies in service delivery." I studied Madison's face, noting how dramatically her demeanor had changed once she understood the true power dynamic of our situation. The condescending expert who had spent months managing my expectations and redirecting, my preferences had been replaced by a desperate employee trying to save her job. "Madison, the problems I've identified aren't minor inconsistencies that can be addressed with policy adjustments. They're systematic ethical violations that have been damaging client relationships and threatening the company's reputation for months." "Please," Madison said, and for the first time since I'd known her, her professional composure was completely absent. "I understand I've made mistakes, but I can learn from this experience and become a better employee. I'll do whatever is necessary to rebuild your trust and prove my commitment to the company's values." "What exactly do you think the company's values are, Madison?" The question seemed to stump her completely. After a long pause, she offered, "Excellence in service delivery and client satisfaction?" "Madison, Clarke Associates was founded on principles of inclusive excellence and personalized service. We built our reputation on celebrating diversity, honoring client visions regardless of budget size, and treating every customer with equal respect and professionalism. You've been systematically violating every single one of those principles." Madison's eyes filled with tears, though I couldn't determine whether they reflected genuine remorse or simply fear about losing her job. "I never intended to violate company values. I was trying to maintain high standards and ensure appropriate service delivery. Appropriate according to whom? You've been deciding which clients deserve quality service based on their backgrounds, budgets, and social status. You've been lying to customers about what's possible within their price ranges while providing superior treatment to clients you personally favor. How is any of that appropriate? I made poor judgment calls, Madison admitted. I let personal assumptions influence my professional decision-making, and I understand that was wrong. But I can change my approach immediately if you'll give me the opportunity to prove I've learned from these mistakes. I looked at Madison sitting across from my desk, finally seeing her without the professional mask that had concealed her true attitudes and practices for months. The confident expert who had made me doubt my own judgment was revealed as someone whose expertise was entirely selective, applied only when she deemed her clients worthy of honest service. Madison, beyond the ethical violations and discriminatory practices, you've also been breach of contract with multiple clients. You've charged identical amounts for dramatically different levels of service, which constitutes fraud. If any of your affected clients decide to pursue legal action, they would have substantial grounds for successful lawsuits. Madison's face went white. Are clients threatening legal action? Not yet. But that's only because most of them trusted your professional guidance and assumed their compromised experiences were the result of budget limitations rather than deliberate service discrimination. What do you need me to do to resolve this situation? Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Madison, I don't think you understand the severity of what's happened here. This isn't a performance issue that can be resolved with coaching or policy clarification. You've been systematically defrauding clients while discriminating against them based on protected characteristics. The legal and ethical violations are severe enough to warrant immediate termination. Please don't fire me, Madison pleaded. I know I've made serious mistakes, but I can make this right. I'll personally contact every affected client and ensure they receive the services they originally requested. I'll work overtime to correct any problems without additional compensation. Madison, some of these events have already taken place. You can't retroactively provide the services you convinced clients were impossible within their budgets. Then I'll provide compensation or additional services to make up for the shortfalls. Whatever it takes to restore client satisfaction and protect the company's reputation. I studied Madison's desperate expression, recognizing that she was finally beginning to grasp the full scope of the consequences her actions had created. But her focus remained on damage control and job preservation rather than genuine understanding of why her behavior had been problematic. Madison, can you explain to me why you treated clients differently based on their backgrounds and budgets? She hesitated for a long moment before answering. I thought I was being strategic about resource allocation and ensuring appropriate matches between client expectations and achievable outcomes. That's not an answer, Madison. That's corporate speak designed to avoid taking responsibility. I'm asking you to be honest about why you decided some clients deserved quality service while others could be manipulated into accepting substandard alternatives. Madison's composure cracked further. I don't know. I guess I assumed that clients with larger budgets and more sophisticated backgrounds would be more demanding and require more attention to detail. And clients with smaller budgets or different cultural backgrounds? I thought they might be more flexible about modifications or substitutions if their original requests weren't practical. Madison, do you understand that what you just described is textbook discrimination? You provided different levels of service based on assumptions about people's backgrounds and financial status rather than their actual needs or preferences. I never thought about it that way, Madison said weakly. I was just trying to manage client expectations and deliver appropriate services within different budget parameters. No, Madison. You were making judgments about who deserved your best work based on your personal biases about class, culture, and social status. And you were using your position as a supposed expert to manipulate clients into accepting those judgments as professional Reality. The room fell silent as Madison processed my words. I could see her struggling to reconcile her self-image as a sophisticated professional with the reality of her discriminatory practices. "What happens now?" she asked finally. "Now, Madison, you're going to learn that actions have consequences, and that the clients you've been dismissing and manipulating have more power than you assumed." Madison's phone buzzed with an incoming call, which she glanced at nervously before looking back at me. "Should I answer that?" "Actually, yes. I think you should take that call. It might be enlightening." Madison answered hesitantly. "Hello, this is Madison. Yes, I planned your wedding last month." "I'm sorry. Can you repeat that?" As Madison listened to whatever the caller was saying, her expression grew increasingly alarmed. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." "No, I never said that. That's not accurate." The call continued for several minutes, with Madison's responses becoming more defensive and less coherent. When she finally hung up, her hands were shaking visibly. "What was that about?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "That was Jennifer Walsh. She's claiming I lied to her about service limitations and charged her for vendors I never actually hired. She says she's contacted other clients who had similar experiences, and they're considering taking legal action against the company." "Against the company, Madison? Or against you personally for fraud and misrepresentation?" Madison stared at me with growing horror as the full implications of her situation became clear. The discriminatory practices and client manipulation she'd been conducting weren't just employment issues. They were potential criminal matters that could result in personal liability and professional ruin. "Sarah, please. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this situation. I'll take full responsibility for any client dissatisfaction and work to make appropriate restitution. Just please don't let this destroy my career." "Madison, you destroyed your own career the moment you decided that some clients deserved honest service, while others could be manipulated and deceived. The consequences you're facing now are the natural result of choices you made consistently over months of deliberate discrimination." Madison's phone rang again, and this time she looked at me pleadingly before answering. The conversation followed. A similar pattern. Another client who had discovered discrepancies between what she'd promised and what she'd delivered. Another threat of legal action. Another demand for explanations Madison couldn't provide. After the second call ended, Madison sat staring at her phone as if it were a weapon pointed at her career. "How many clients are calling?" "Madison, I think the more important question is how many clients you've been deceiving, because each one of them has the right to understand what really happened to their events and why they received substandard service despite paying for professional expertise." "You told them," Madison said, her voice hollow with realization. "I told them the truth, Madison. Something you apparently decided they didn't deserve." Madison's transformation was complete. The confident professional who had walked into my office that morning had been replaced by someone who finally understood that her actions had consequences and that her victims had the power to hold her accountable. "What do you want from me?" she asked desperately. "Madison, what I want is for you to understand that every client deserves honest service, professional respect, and equal treatment regardless of their background or budget. But I don't think you're capable of providing that, which is why your employment at Clarke Associates is terminated effective immediately." The words hung in the air between us as Madison processed the finality of her situation. After months of manipulating and dismissing clients she deemed unworthy of her full attention, she was facing the consequences of treating the wrong person as a powerless victim rather than recognizing her as the authority figure who controlled her professional future. "Please," Madison whispered one final time, "give me another chance to prove I can change." "Madison, you've had months of chances to treat clients with respect and honesty. You chose to discriminate, manipulate, and deceive instead. Now you get to experience what it feels like when someone else has the power to determine your future." As security arrived to escort Madison from the building, I realized that this confrontation was about much more than employee termination or wedding planning disputes. It was about accountability, justice, and the recognition that people in positions of power have responsibilities to treat others with dignity, regardless of their perceived status or value. Madison had built her career on the assumption that some people's voices mattered more than others, that some clients deserved honesty while others could be manipulated with impunity. She was about to discover that she'd been very wrong about who had real power in this situation, and that her victims were capable of holding her accountable for her choices. The game had changed completely, and Madison Clarke was no longer in control. After security escorted Madison from the building, I sat in my office for several minutes processing what had just occurred. The confrontation I'd been preparing for all week had exceeded my expectations in terms of both Madison's defensive desperation and the immediate consequences of her actions. But more than that, I felt a profound shift in my own sense of authority and clarity that extended far beyond this single employment situation. For months, I had allowed Madison to manipulate my confidence and undermine my judgment, not just about wedding planning, but about my own capabilities as a business owner and decision maker. The systematic way she had convinced me to doubt my preferences while positioning herself as the indispensable expert had been a masterclass in psychological manipulation that I was only now fully understanding. Rebecca knocked softly on my door before entering with a cup of coffee and what looked like a concerned expression. "Ms. Chen, is everything all right?" Madison seemed quite upset when she left, and she didn't take any of her personal items from her office. "Madison's employment has been terminated effective immediately," I replied. "Please arrange for her personal belongings to be packed and available for pickup by the end of the week. Also, send a company-wide email announcing that Madison Clarke is no longer with the firm and that all her client responsibilities are being redistributed among our remaining team members." Rebecca nodded professionally, though I could see curiosity in her eyes about the sudden termination. "Should I include any specific information about the transition process for Madison's current clients?" "Yes. Please include that affected clients will be contacted personally by me to discuss their projects and ensure seamless continuation of services. Also, please schedule a staff meeting for this afternoon so I can address the situation with the entire team." After Rebecca left, I spent the next hour developing a comprehensive action plan for addressing the fallout from Madison's termination while rebuilding trust with affected clients. The scope of the challenge was significant, but I felt energized rather than overwhelmed by the prospect of taking direct control of situations that had been managed poorly for too long. My first priority was contacting Madison's current clients to personally apologize for any service shortfalls and commit to delivering the celebrations they had originally envisioned. This wasn't just damage control. It was an opportunity to demonstrate the level of professional service that Clarke Associates was truly capable of providing when client needs were prioritized over personal biases and convenience. The call to Jennifer Walsh was particularly important, given that she had been one of the most vocal clients about Madison's deceptive practices. When I reached her, Jennifer's voice carried a mixture of anger and relief that someone was finally taking her concerns seriously. "Ms. Chen, I appreciate you calling personally, but I have to be honest. The experience with Madison has really damaged my trust in your company. I paid for professional event planning services and received something completely different from what was promised. Jennifer, I understand your frustration completely, and I take full responsibility for the inadequate service you received. Madison's approach to client management was unacceptable and has resulted in her immediate termination. But more importantly, I want to discuss how we can make this situation right for you." "What do you mean by making it right? The wedding already happened, and it wasn't what we wanted or paid for." "I'd like to offer you a full refund of all fees paid to Clarke Associates, plus compensation for any additional expenses you incurred due to Madison's service failures. Additionally, if you're planning any other events in the future, anniversary parties, family celebrations, corporate functions. I'd like to provide those services at no charge to demonstrate the level of quality you should have received originally." The silence on the line lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had been disconnected. When Jennifer finally responded, her voice had softened considerably. "Ms. Chen, that's an incredibly generous offer. I wasn't expecting anything like that level of accountability from your company." Jennifer, Clarke Associates built its reputation on treating every client with respect and delivering personalized service that exceeds expectations. Madison's discriminatory practices violated everything we stand for as a company. The least I can do is ensure that you're compensated for her professional failures. After concluding the call with Jennifer, I spent the rest of the morning reaching out to other clients who had been affected by Madison's tiered service approach. Each conversation followed a similar pattern: initial skepticism about my company's integrity, followed by genuine appreciation for my willingness to take responsibility and provide meaningful compensation for service failures. What struck me most during these conversations was how many clients had internalized Madison's manipulative explanations for why their original visions weren't possible. They had been convinced that their preferences were unrealistic, their budgets were insufficient, or their cultural elements were inappropriate, when in reality, Madison had simply decided they weren't worth her full professional effort. Mrs. Patricia Gonzalez, whose daughter's quinceañera had been stripped of traditional Mexican elements because Madison claimed they would overwhelm guests unfamiliar with cultural traditions, was particularly emotional during our conversation. Ms. Chen, Madison made us feel like we were being difficult for wanting to honor our heritage. She convinced us that a more universal approach would be better for everyone, but it ended up feeling like our daughter's celebration belonged to someone else entirely. Mrs. Gonzalez, I am deeply sorry that happened to your family. Cultural celebration should be honored and elevated, never diminished or hidden. If you would consider allowing us to plan another event for your family, perhaps your daughter's upcoming graduation or a family anniversary, I would personally ensure that every traditional element you wanted is beautifully incorporated and celebrated. You would really do that? Mrs. Gonzalez, it would be my privilege to show you and your family the level of respect and cultural celebration that you deserved from the beginning. By lunchtime, I had spoken with 12 of Madison's former clients, offering full refunds and future services to compensate for the discriminatory treatment they had received. The financial impact was significant, but the restoration of trust and company reputation was invaluable. More importantly, these conversations were rebuilding my own confidence in my ability to provide exceptional service when client needs were genuinely prioritized. The staff meeting that afternoon was one of the most important leadership moments of my career. I had assembled my entire team in the main conference room, including designers, coordinators, administrative staff, and vendor liaison. Everyone knew that Madison had been terminated, but they didn't understand the scope of the problems her practices had created. "Thank you all for gathering on short notice," I began, standing at the head of the conference table where I'd made so many important business decisions over the years. "As you know, Madison Clarke is no longer with our company. I want to discuss why that decision was made and what it means for our operations moving forward." I spent the next 30 minutes outlining Madison's discriminatory practices without naming specific clients or revealing confidential details. The team's reactions ranged from shock to embarrassment to anger as they realized that a colleague had been systematically violating the company's core values while representing Clarke Associates to the public. David Martinez, our senior event coordinator who had been with the company for 3 years, raised his hand during the discussion. "Ms. Chen, I had no idea Madison was providing different levels of service based on client backgrounds. If I had known, I would have reported it immediately." "David, I don't hold anyone on this team responsible for Madison's individual choices. Her discrimination was carefully concealed from both colleagues and clients through professional manipulation and deceptive documentation. But this situation has highlighted the need for better oversight and accountability measures. Sarah Chen, one of our most talented designers, looked troubled as she spoke. I noticed that Madison seemed to have very different attitudes toward different clients, but I assumed it was just personality differences or project management styles. I never suspected she was actually providing unequal service. Sarah, that's exactly why discrimination can be so insidious. Madison was skilled at making her biases appear to be professional judgments rather than personal prejudices. Going forward, we need systems in place that ensure every client receives consistent quality, regardless of who's managing their project. The discussion continued for another hour, with team members sharing observations about Madison's behavior that had seemed odd at the time but made sense in the context of her discriminatory practices. Several staff members mentioned feeling uncomfortable with some of Madison's comments about clients, but hadn't felt empowered to challenge what appeared to be professional expertise. Moving forward, I announced, we're implementing new policies that will prevent this kind of situation from occurring again. Every client file will be subject to random quality audits. All vendor communications will be documented and reviewed. Most importantly, any team member who observes potential discrimination or unethical behavior is not only encouraged, but required to report it immediately. The meeting concluded with renewed energy and commitment from the entire team. What had begun as a crisis management session had evolved into a recommitment to the values that had made Clarke Associates successful. More than that, it had established my authority as a leader who was willing to take decisive action to protect both client interests and company integrity. That evening, I met James for dinner at our favorite neighborhood restaurant, eager to share the events of the day and discuss the impact on our wedding planning. James had been incredibly supportive throughout the Madison situation, but I knew he was curious about how her termination would affect our own celebration. "So Madison is completely out of the picture now?" James asked as we settled into our usual corner booth. "Completely. And James, I feel like I can breathe clearly for the first time in months. I had no idea how much her manipulation was affecting my confidence and decision-making until I stepped outside of her influence. What does this mean for our wedding? Do we need to start over with planning, or can we salvage what's already been arranged?" I smiled, feeling genuinely excited about our celebration for the first time since we'd begun working with Madison. We're going to plan exactly the wedding we originally wanted. Everything Madison told us was impossible or inappropriate is going back on the table. Outdoor ceremony, jewel-toned florals, jazz musicians, cultural elements honoring both our backgrounds. All of it. And you think we can pull that together with only 4 months until the wedding? James, I've been planning events for 5 years. I know exactly what's possible within our timeline and budget. Madison's claims about limitations and challenges were completely fabricated to justify providing us with generic service instead of personalized attention. Over dinner, I outlined my vision for not just our wedding, but for the transformation of Clarke Associates moving forward. Madison's termination wasn't just about removing a problematic employee. It was about reclaiming the company's original mission of inclusive excellence and personalized service. I want every client to feel the way I should have felt during our wedding planning process, I explained. Heard, respected, and confident that their vision is being brought to life by professionals who genuinely care about their celebration. It sounds like this experience, as difficult as it's been, has actually strengthened your understanding of what you want your company to represent. Exactly. I've learned more about leadership, accountability, and authentic service in the past week than I did in the previous year of running the business on autopilot. The next morning brought unexpected validation of my decision to terminate Madison's employment. Rebecca entered my office with a printed email that had arrived overnight from the Better Business Bureau, forwarding a formal complaint about Clarke, and associates that had been filed by a client Madison had served 6 months earlier. The complaint detailed systematic service failures, discriminatory treatment, and misrepresentation of vendor capabilities that matched perfectly with the patterns I had discovered in Madison's other client relationships. What was particularly damning was that the client had documented their interactions with Madison through email chains that proved deliberate deception rather than miscommunication. "Ms. Chen," Rebecca said as I finished reading the complaint, "there are 3 more similar complaints that arrived this morning. It seems like word is spreading about Madison's practices, and clients are coming forward with their own experiences. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by these additional problems, I felt energized by the opportunity to address systematic issues that had been hidden for months. Each complaint represented a client who deserved better service and an opportunity for Clarke Associates to demonstrate genuine accountability. I spent the morning personally responding to each complaint, taking full responsibility for Madison's conduct while outlining specific steps for remediation and compensation. I offered to meet personally with each affected client to discuss their experiences and develop appropriate solutions for any service failures. The response from clients was remarkable. What could have become a public relations disaster was transforming into an opportunity to demonstrate authentic leadership and customer service excellence. Clients who had felt dismissed and manipulated were experiencing direct attention from the company owner, often for the first time since their events had concluded. By midday, I had scheduled face-to-face meetings with 6 affected clients to discuss their experiences and develop compensation packages that reflected the severity of Madison's service failures. More importantly, several clients had expressed interest in working with Clarke Associates again in the future, based on their confidence in my personal commitment to ethical service delivery. The afternoon brought an unexpected call from Lisa Rodriguez, my event planning colleague who had confirmed that Madison's claims about budget limitations were fabricated. Lisa's voice carried excitement and professional curiosity when I answered. "Sarah, I've been hearing some interesting rumors about changes at Clarke Associates. Word is spreading through the industry that you terminated an employee for discriminatory practices and are personally compensating affected clients." "Word travels fast in this business," I replied. "Yes, I discovered that one of my employees had been providing unequal service based on client backgrounds and budgets. The situation required immediate correction." "Sarah, do you realize what a big deal this is? Most companies would have handled this quietly, maybe with some internal discipline or policy adjustments. You're taking public responsibility and providing meaningful compensation to affected customers. That's virtually unprecedented in our industry." Lisa's observation made me realize that my response to Madison's discrimination was being viewed as notable leadership rather than standard business practice. In an industry where client complaints were often dismissed or minimized, my willingness to take full responsibility and provide substantial compensation was generating positive attention from colleagues and vendors. "I'm not trying to make a statement," I explained. "I'm just trying to do what's right for clients who were treated unfairly by someone representing my company." "Sarah, whether you intended it or not, you're setting a new standard for accountability and client service. I've had 3 vendors call me today asking about potential partnerships with Clarke Associates because they're impressed with your integrity and leadership." That afternoon's client meetings proved even more productive than I had anticipated. Rather than angry confrontations about service failures, the conversations became collaborative discussions about how to restore trust and create positive future relationships. Ms. Angela Thompson, whose anniversary party had been diminished by Madison's refusal to incorporate the jazz music she and her husband loved, was particularly gracious during our meeting. "Ms. Chen, I came here expecting to demand explanations and refunds. Instead, I'm leaving with complete confidence that you genuinely care about your clients' experiences and satisfaction. Ms. Thompson, your celebration should have honored your musical preferences from the beginning. Madison's dismissal of your requests was unprofessional and disrespectful." What I appreciate most is that you're not making excuses or blaming communication problems. You're taking responsibility and offering real solutions. That level of accountability is rare in any business, but especially in service industries. Each client meeting reinforced my understanding of what authentic customer service required. Not just technical competence, but genuine respect for client visions and preferences regardless of budget size or cultural background. Madison's approach had treated service delivery as a favor to be earned rather than a professional obligation to be fulfilled. By the end of the week, I had transformed what could have been a company-threatening crisis into an opportunity for demonstrating exceptional leadership and customer service. The financial cost of compensation and refunds was significant, but the restoration of company reputation and client trust was invaluable. More importantly, I had reclaimed my own confidence and authority as both a business owner and a bride. Planning her wedding. The self-doubt and uncertainty that Madison had skillfully cultivated through months of manipulation had been replaced by clear understanding of my own judgment and capabilities. Friday afternoon brought the most satisfying moment of the entire week. I was reviewing vendor proposals for our wedding when Rebecca announced that I had a visitor in the lobby, someone asking to speak with me about event planning services. The visitor turned out to be Margaret Harrison, a prominent local attorney whose daughter was getting married in 8 months. Margaret's reputation for demanding excellence and attention to detail had made her a challenging client for several event planning companies, and she had a history of detailed contracts and extensive oversight of vendor performance. Ms. Chen, Margaret began as she settled into the chair across from my desk. I've been researching event planning companies for my daughter's wedding, and your name keeps coming up in conversations with colleagues and vendors. I appreciate the referral, I replied. What specific vision does your daughter have for her celebration? That's exactly what I wanted to discuss. My daughter has some very specific cultural and aesthetic preferences that other planners have suggested might be challenging to execute within our timeline and budget. But I've heard that you have a different approach to client service and cultural celebration. As Margaret described her daughter's vision, a fusion celebration incorporating both Jewish and Indian traditions with contemporary elegance, I found myself energized by the creative challenge and cultural significance of the event. Everything about the project represented exactly the kind of inclusive, personalized service that Clarke Associates was founded to provide. Ms. Chen, Margaret concluded, I've heard that you recently made some difficult personnel decisions to ensure that all clients receive equal treatment regardless of their backgrounds or budgets. That level of integrity is exactly what our family values, and it's why I want to work with your company. Margaret, it would be my honor to plan your daughter's wedding. Cultural fusion celebrations are among my favorite projects because they require creativity, sensitivity, and genuine appreciation for the traditions being honored. There's one more thing, Margaret added with a slight smile. My daughter specifically requested that you personally manage her planning process rather than delegating to another team member. She said she wants to work with someone who has proven they will fight for their clients' visions rather than compromise based on convenience or prejudice. As Margaret left my office with a signed contract and an appointment scheduled for the following week, I realized that Madison's termination had done more than solve an internal personnel problem. It had established Clarke Associates as a company willing to prioritize client integrity over employee convenience, cultural celebration over generic solutions, and authentic service over discriminatory practices. The transformation felt complete when James arrived that evening to discuss our own wedding planning. We spread vendor proposals, venue options, and design concepts across my dining room table, but this time the conversation was filled with excitement, rather than uncertainty. Sarah, everything you're showing me tonight is exactly what we talked about 6 months ago, James observed as he reviewed photographs of potential ceremony sites. These are the same venues, the same vendors, the same aesthetic choices that Madison convinced us were impractical. James, that's because our original vision was never impractical. Madison just didn't think we were worth the effort required to execute it properly. And now? Now we're planning our dream wedding with vendors who are excited to create something meaningful and beautiful. We're honoring both our cultural backgrounds, incorporating the music we love, and creating the intimate celebration we originally envisioned. As we finalized details for our outdoor ceremony and jazz-filled reception, I reflected on how dramatically my understanding of both business leadership and personal authority had evolved over the past week. Madison's manipulation had been subtle and sophisticated, designed to make me doubt my own judgment while feeling grateful for her professional guidance. But confronting her discrimination and taking decisive action to protect my clients had restored not just my business integrity, but my confidence in my own capabilities. I was no longer the uncertain bride seeking expert validation for my preferences. I was the business owner who had transformed a potential crisis into an opportunity for demonstrating authentic leadership and exceptional service. The game had changed completely, and I was finally playing by my own rules rather than accepting limitations imposed by someone else's biases and prejudices. Madison's attempt to control and manipulate had ultimately empowered me to reclaim my authority and transform my company into exactly the kind of organization I had always intended it to be. Most importantly, I was planning a wedding that would truly represent who James and I were as a couple, rather than accepting a generic version. Designed to meet someone else's narrow definition of appropriate celebration, the emerald green bridesmaid dresses, the outdoor jazz ceremony, the fusion menu honoring both our heritages, everything Madison had dismissed as impractical was coming together beautifully within our original budget and timeline. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and the results were exceeding every expectation I had dared to hold. 3 months later, on a perfect September afternoon with golden sunlight filtering through ancient oak trees, I stood at the edge of the Botanical Gardens ceremony space, watching James adjust his tie nervously as our guests found their seats. Everything about this moment felt exactly right in a way I had never imagined possible during those months of doubt and compromise. The venue was stunning in its natural elegance, precisely the kind of intimate outdoor setting Madison had convinced us was impractical and risky. White garden chairs arranged in a semicircle around a simple wooden arch draped with emerald silk and burgundy dahlias created the perfect backdrop for the celebration we had always envisioned. Jazz musicians warmed up softly in the background, their instruments catching glints of afternoon light as they prepared to soundtrack our ceremony. Rebecca appeared at my side, radiant in her emerald bridesmaid dress, holding the bouquet of deep purple orchids and white roses that perfectly captured the sophisticated jewel-tone palette Madison had dismissed as photographically challenging. "Sarah, you look absolutely breathtaking, and this setting is more beautiful than anything I've ever seen in wedding magazines." I smiled, adjusting the delicate silver bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother, a small nod to my Chinese heritage that Madison had suggested might confuse guests unfamiliar with cultural traditions. Today, every element that had been deemed inappropriate or impractical was seamlessly woven into a celebration that felt authentically ours. The months following Madison's termination had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond wedding planning. Clarke Associates had not only recovered from the crisis, but had emerged stronger, more focused, and more successful than ever before. Word of my willingness to take responsibility for employee misconduct and compensate affected clients had spread throughout the industry, generating respect from colleagues and attracting new clients who valued integrity and accountability. The company's reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by the transparency with which I had addressed Madison's discriminatory practices. Vendors appreciated working with a firm that prioritized honest client relationships over manipulative profit maximization. Clients trusted that their visions would be honored regardless of their backgrounds or budget limitations. Most importantly, my team understood that excellence meant treating every customer with equal respect and professional dedication. Margaret Harrison's daughter's wedding had become a showcase event that demonstrated Clarke & Associates' commitment to cultural celebration and personalized service. The fusion of Jewish and Indian traditions had been executed flawlessly, generating magazine coverage and industry recognition that established our company as a leader in inclusive event planning. But the professional success paled in comparison to the personal growth I had experienced through confronting Madison's manipulation and reclaiming my own authority. The self-doubt and uncertainty that had characterized my interactions with her had been replaced by confidence in my judgment and trust in my capabilities. As the string quartet began playing our processional music, a jazz arrangement of a classical piece that perfectly captured our aesthetic, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. Madison's attempt to diminish and control our celebration had ultimately forced me to clarify exactly what we wanted and fight for our right to have it. James's eyes lit up as I appeared at the top of the garden path, and I saw in his expression the same joy and excitement that I felt about the celebration we had created together. This wasn't a wedding planned by someone else's vision of appropriate celebration. It was a genuine reflection of who we were as a couple and what we valued. As partners, the ceremony itself was everything we had hoped for and more. Our officiant, a family friend who had known both our families for years, wove together elements that honored our different backgrounds while celebrating our shared future. James's Irish heritage was acknowledged through traditional blessings, while my Chinese background was represented through tea ceremony elements that added depth and meaning to our vows. When we exchanged rings, simple platinum bands that complemented rather than competed with my grandmother's bracelet, I felt the completion of a journey that had tested my resolve but ultimately strengthened my understanding of what authentic partnership required. James had supported my decision to confront Madison's discrimination, even when it meant potential conflict and uncertainty. His trust in my judgment had been unwavering throughout the process. The reception was magical in ways that Madison's generic elegance could never have achieved. Tables arranged throughout the garden's terraced levels created intimate conversation spaces while maintaining the dinner party atmosphere we had originally requested. The menu featured dishes that reflected both our heritages: Korean barbecue, sliders alongside Irish soda bread, spring rolls next to shepherd's pie, creating a culinary celebration that honored our backgrounds without overwhelming guests. Most importantly, every guest seemed genuinely engaged and delighted by the personalized touches that made our celebration unique. The jazz trio performed during dinner, creating the sophisticated musical backdrop we had always envisioned. Cultural elements were seamlessly integrated rather than hidden or minimized, allowing our families to share their traditions with friends who might not have experienced them before. As the evening progressed and guests moved between the dance floor and conversation areas, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my understanding of leadership and authority had evolved. 6 months earlier, I had allowed an employee to convince me that my preferences were naive and my vision was inappropriate. Tonight, I was celebrating exactly the wedding we had originally planned, executed flawlessly within our original budget and timeline. The transformation hadn't been limited to wedding planning. My approach to business leadership had become more decisive and confident, informed by the recognition that authentic authority required taking responsibility for outcomes rather than delegating difficult decisions to others. I was no longer willing to compromise my values or my vision based on someone else's assessment of what was appropriate or achievable. James found me during a quiet moment between dances, wrapping his arms around me as we watched our families mingling on the garden terrace. "Sarah, this is perfect. Everything about tonight is exactly what we dreamed of when we first got engaged." "It's better than what we dreamed of," I replied, "because we fought for it instead of accepting someone else's version of what our celebration should be." "Do you think we would have had the confidence to insist on what we wanted if Madison hadn't pushed us so far?" It was a thoughtful question that I had considered many times during the planning process. I think we would have eventually realized that her approach wasn't serving our interests, but it might have taken longer and been less definitive. Her manipulation forced me to confront the difference between genuine expertise and professional manipulation disguised as guidance. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart with heartfelt congratulations and requests for Clarke Associates business cards, I felt a deep sense of completion that went beyond the successful execution of our wedding. The celebration had demonstrated that inclusive excellence and cultural authenticity could coexist beautifully with sophisticated elegance and professional execution. The final moment of validation came when Mrs. Gonzalez approached me near the end of the reception, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for showing her family that their cultural traditions could be celebrated with dignity and beauty. Ms. Chen, watching your wedding tonight has given me so much hope for my daughter's future celebrations. You've shown us that we don't have to choose between honoring our heritage and creating something elegant and sophisticated. Mrs. Gonzalez, your heritage is what makes celebrations meaningful and personal. Any planner who suggests otherwise isn't worthy of your trust or your business. As James and I left the reception in a vintage car decorated with emerald ribbons and white flowers, I looked back at the botanical garden where our celebration had exceeded every expectation. The venue that Madison had declared impractical was perfect. The cultural elements she had deemed overwhelming were seamlessly integrated. The budget she had claimed was insufficient had covered every detail we had originally requested. Most importantly, the confidence and authority I had reclaimed through confronting her discrimination had enabled me to create not just a beautiful wedding, but a celebration that authentically represented our values and vision as a couple. 6 months later, Clarke Associates had become the most sought-after event planning company in the region, with a waiting list of clients who specifically requested services that honored their cultural backgrounds and personal preferences regardless of budget size. The industry recognition we received for inclusive excellence and authentic client service had established new standards for professional accountability and ethical business practices. Madison's termination had been upheld through multiple appeals and reviews, with industry associations citing her case as an example of why discriminatory practices damaged both individual companies and the profession as a whole. Her attempts to find employment with competing firms had been unsuccessful, as word of her unethical practices had spread throughout the professional network. But more than professional success or industry recognition, the experience had taught me that authentic authority comes from the willingness to stand up for what's right, rather than accepting what's convenient. Madison's manipulation had been effective precisely because it exploited my desire to be accommodating and my trust in professional expertise. The lesson that would stay with me throughout my career was that true leadership requires the courage to challenge systems and people who prioritize their own comfort over client service, even when that challenge involves personal and professional risk. As I sat in my office on the anniversary of Madison's termination, reviewing proposals for upcoming celebrations that would honor diverse traditions and cultural backgrounds, I felt grateful for the crisis that had forced me to clarify my values and fight for my vision. The bride who had once doubted her own judgment and accepted limitations imposed by someone else's biases had become the business owner who fought for every client's right to authentic celebration and respectful service. Madison's attempt to control and diminish had ultimately empowered me to transform both my company and my understanding of what authentic leadership required. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been completely redefined in favor of integrity, accountability, and genuine respect for every client's vision and worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.